This week, I'm revisiting and revising another one of my older, dated tutorials. This time, it's the process of pulling handles turn, a skill that can be notoriously difficult to learn. But I think after watching this video, you should have a much more thorough understanding of every step along the way. In short, handle pulling is what you can see here. It's the method of attaching a thicker blank of clay onto a cup, which is then pulled thinner and finer, bent downward and joined back onto the cup near the base. This is just one of many methods for making handles for pottery, and it's this technique that I must have pulled thousands of handles with during my apprenticeship. It's a relatively traditional method, and so, in the same way I was taught this skill, I hope this video provides you with both the basics and some of the more advanced techniques needed to make handles like this. And we're going to be starting from the beginning, and I think that starts with trimming the actual pots, as there are a few things done at this stage which can help make the process a bit easier. The first is this chuck. This is what I trim the pots on both before they've been handled and after, and it helps to keep the rims of these pots nice and round, as inevitably the process of attaching and pulling a handle on a mug like this can potentially distort the opening to be slightly more oval in shape. Secondly, when freshly trimmed, pots become slightly softer than they were before, as you've carved away the drier outer layers. This means if you try and attach and pull a handle immediately after they've been turned, you'll probably end up distorting the shape if the pots do have relatively thin walls. So instead, what I do is trim all my work, and then I leave all the pots uncovered for maybe 30 minutes, or until their tacky, slightly sticky surfaces have firmed up again. And a quick push down of the cup onto the chuck like this is all I do to ensure the rim is lovely and round. The chuck itself, in between uses, is soaked and wrapped up tightly in plastic. This way it can be kept leather hard for years. This one must be more than 2 years old at this point. Now, before I can begin pulling handles, I first have to prepare my tools. The first thing I do is line a wearboard with plastic. This is going to be where I store my freshly handled mugs, as it's imperative as I'm joining soft clay onto leather hard clay that I dry them very slowly and carefully. They can be lined up on here and eventually wrapped up, and by making sure the board is covered in plastic, this means the wood won't wick moisture out from the bases of the mugs, as this can potentially cause them to dry out unevenly, which is a contributing factor to cracks potentially forming around the joins, which is something we're going to try and avoid at all costs. Next, we need some slip, which is just watered down clay, and a serrated kidney. We'll also need a basin of water. This is the lubricant which helps us stretch the clay out and form the handles. Having a larger basin also helps to contain any mess made, making the process slightly less messy. And for the love of God, if you are doing this in winter, please use warm water. You'll also need a sponge and a cloth, as being able to quickly clean and dry your hands or just a few fingers as you're pulling is really helpful. We also have to make sure that our cups are the right consistency before handles can be attached to them. This is an example of a cup that's too soft to have a handle attached. When I gently press the rim, the entire shape distorts, and that's with just a small amount of pressure. Instead, what I'm looking for is a cup like this. Although it looks exactly the same, when I press the rim gently, the clay is firm enough that it holds its shape. Yet, it's still definitely leather hard. And if instead your pots look like this, with parts of it bordering on being bone dry, then you've let them go too far, as trying to attach very soft clay to stuff like this will more than likely end in disaster, as there's such a disparity between the consistency of the two clays. When pulling handles like this, you have to monitor the clay's condition with an eagle eye, and often that means wrapping them up to halt the drying process, especially if you're working in warmer environments. Not only that, but the drier clay becomes, the more brittle it is. So if you are pulling handles on clay that's this dry, the chance that you create hairline cracks in the rim is much greater. So what we want is something like this, a cup that's on the firm side of leather hard, but absolutely not approaching bone dry. Another thing I do to check they're in the right condition is run my fingers down the outside of the pots. If I feel like my fingertips are sticking to the surface of the clay, then it's too soft. Whereas with this piece on the right, my fingertips just glide over the surface. I know this is a difficult thing to explain through video alone, but the surface, instead of being quite damp and tacky, needs to be a bit warmer and sleek when you run your fingers over it. Another thing that will happen if the pot is too soft is you'll leave very light fingerprints on the surface when you drag your digits over the clay. Whereas again, on the pot that's ready to go, when I gently brush the surface, my fingertips don't leave any marks. Of course, if the walls of your pots are thicker, you can get away handling them when they are a bit soft, but with cups as thin as this, you really can't. But despite the vessel being very thin all over, you can see that the clay is the same consistency throughout. The rims aren't drier than the base, and up until this point I've been monitoring the cups to ensure that they are the perfect state of leather hard to have handles attached. And in some ways this is just as much a skill as pulling handles is, as being able to assess the state of clay when it's too soft or when it's too dry is vital to the success of pulling handles, as getting it right only makes the process of pulling easier. And while we're on that subject, let's talk about the clay we're going to be pulling the handles with. Ideally, I use stuff that's the same consistency as I would throw with. If the clay is too soft, the handles that you're pulling won't have much strength, and they'll tend to sag and they'll have a harder time keeping their shape. On the other hand, if it's too firm, you'll have to use an excessive amount of pressure to stretch the clay, and the chance that you simply tear the handles off the cups is much greater. The clay being relatively soft and plastic is actually really important, as you'll be able to create neater joins as you can blend the soft clay into the cup more easily. So, in preparation to make the handle blanks, I'm going to roll out a thick coil like this, which is thicker on one end and tapers to a finer point on the other. It really doesn't have to be perfect, but if it's smoother, you should have an easier time gliding your hand over it to stretch the clay out. This is the shape I'm aiming for, which I then pinch around the top just a little bit to create a groove that makes it easier to hold. Now, this process of pulling might look a bit unorderly and random, but there is a lot of thought going on as I do this, especially regarding the shape of my right hand, the one that's stretching the length downward. And these remain relevant from pulling blanks to pulling handles like this later on. So let's break them down. First off, I'm going to have to ask you to imagine that this smaller lump of clay is a cross-section of the handle or handle blank I'm pulling. And whenever you squeeze or try and manipulate the length of clay, it's done with a wet hand. Remember that. When I squeeze the length of clay with my right hand, I'm pinching between my index finger and thumb. I pinch at the top of the lump of clay and then run this pressure downward, and it's this motion that stretches the clay out and begins to create the flatter, oval shape I want. I'm squeezing with equal pressure with my thumb and finger on opposite sides of the piece of clay, between this gap, which is like a vice gripping the clay between two parallel lines. This is the grip I use when I focus on creating length. As for creating the round edges of the handle, I use more of the corner of my hand, where the naturally soft and curved skin is between my finger and thumb. I press my hand into the clay. This way, when I run my hand from top to bottom, the wetted clay runs through this point, creating a curved, even surface on the piece of clay. And this is when we encounter another very important part of pulling handles, which is what you do to one side, you must do to the other, as you want handles to be even in cross-section, especially once you're pulling the blank into the finished handle on the cup. So when I'm pulling, you'll see that I work one side and then turn the cup around to work on the other. Of course, in actuality, you end up using a much smaller piece of clay, but these are the two fundamental movements I use. I pull and pinch from top to bottom to create length, and I also pull from the side with the clay pressed into the loose, soft skin between finger and thumb. It's this that creates the rounded edges of my handles. And all of that is done on a longer length, like this initially, pinching harder towards the top where the clay is thicker and gradually stretching the clay out longer and longer. The last thing that often comes up is just how much pressure do I use? And annoyingly, that's perhaps the hardest part to answer, as depending on the clay you're using, its firmness, your own strength, and the handles you want to produce, the answer can change. But simply put, at the beginning I use more pressure when the clay is thicker, and gradually it lessens off. So I soak my hand and I begin pinching right towards the top of the lump of clay, squeeze and then drag down. The lump of clay is then rotated and I pull the other side. But initially, as the chunk I'm starting out with is so thick, I'll begin by simply pinching and pulling all the way around to create a length that's thinner and easier to work. My aim is to essentially create as long a length as I can that's even in cross-section, and you'll notice that my pulling hand moves very quickly, as this tends to leave a more even, consistent surface. And at this point, when there's still a lot more thinning out to do, I make sure both my hand and the length of clay is always wet, as if either part dries out, it'll stick to the other, and that's normally when you begin tearing off bits of clay. Now that the length is a bit more manageable, I'll switch to using the parallel grip I showed you earlier to begin extending its length, and every couple of pulls I'll switch to using the curved portion of my hand to round off the sides. If I begin to notice it's a bit thinner in one spot than another, I'll shift my focus to apply pressure on the part that's thicker, which in this case was the end. It's also really worth mentioning that if you are just learning to pull handles, don't try and make them as long as this. Work with smaller bits of clay like this, creating lengths of about 20 to 30 centimeters or less. If you pull one neat and even length of clay at a time, enough for just a single handle, that's totally fine at the start. And with time you can progress to longer lengths from which you'll be able to segment out many individual blanks. What I'm creating here isn't the finished, final handle. Instead, they're thicker, less refined lumps, which will later be attached to the cups I've thrown and trimmed and pulled into their final shape. As I pull, you'll notice that I often run my hand well past the length itself, as if you release pressure too early, you'll end up creating a bulbous lump at the end. In this instance, there is a tiny bulge, which I'll just snip off to create a more even length. And once this strand of clay is to my liking, approximately 2 centimeters wide, and a cross-section that looks like this, I can move on to the next step, which is to segment this longer strand into many individual blanks. I find a sharp edge, such as a wearboard or the side of a table, and I lay the length out, like so, and then snip it off. I then place the next blank directly next to it. They can touch at this stage, that's absolutely fine, and that one's cut off too. I'll keep doing this as many times as I can until the length of clay begins to widen again as it approaches the larger lump in my hand, at which point I go back to the start, pulling another long strand to create into more individual blanks like this. I use the side of my thumb to snip them off right against the edge, with my other fingers pressing up on the wood beneath it. A cleaner, straighter cut at this stage will make the next step a bit easier, but it's not crucial. Now, theoretically, you could use an extruder to do this entire process for you, to create these blanks, but it's by no means a bad thing learning to do it by hand, like this, as it means you don't have to rely on any equipment when making handles for your pots. It also means, if I'm handling say a batch of mugs and a batch of espresso cups, which have handles that differ in size, I can simply pull a batch of blanks that are larger and then a batch of blanks that are smaller, without having to change the die plate of the extruder. Instead, I just change the shape of my hand. Not only that, but I'm sure any potter watching will know what a pain it is to clean out an extruder. It may be faster to use an extruder if you're a beginner, but I'd wager that a well-practiced handle puller using this method is faster, neater, and the blanks themselves produced won't contain any pockets of air which always distort and destroy a couple of the blanks, nor will they have any rough edges, and all that time spent tidying up the extruder can instead be spent on making handles themselves. Anyway, one method isn't better than the other, and there are ultimately pros and cons to both. The main one with this method being that it's a much more difficult skill to learn. Now, you don't have to worry about any fingerprints on these or very minor indentations, as these are all going to be attached onto the cups and pulled again, but it's paramount that we keep these nice and soft, as if they stay on the wooden surface for too long, that will draw moisture out of the bottom of them, hardening one side, giving the blanks an uneven consistency which will make pulling them harder later on. You can get away with it in the colder months, or if you're only pulling a couple of handles, but whenever I'm working on a larger scale, I transfer these onto a sheet of plastic. This way I can spray them with water and even wrap them up as the day goes on, so they stay really lovely and soft. Now, again, it's worth mentioning that the shapes of your blanks really depend on the shapes of the cups you're making, but if you are just beginning, it's probably best to start with ones that are perhaps a bit bigger than you think, as it's better to have a bit too much material to work with as compared to too little. When I attach these blanks to the cups, there is a specific orientation I'll place them, and that's with any curved portion facing down, thus becoming the inside curve of the handle. It may be that both sides of your blank are curved, in which case it doesn't matter, but if one side's flat and one side's curved, make sure you attach it to the vessel with the curved portion underneath. This is because when pulling, it's much easier to alter the shape of the top of the handle, whereas the underside can be a bit more difficult to shape. But if the underside is flat, it will likely only become more so as you pull, and a flat surface on the inside can be quite uncomfortable to hold, as your fingers, when you bend them, naturally create a curve, which means a rounded, ovoid shape fits into your grip a bit more comfortably, especially compared to a handle that's more squared off and has blocky, sharp edges. So what I'm aiming for in my final cross-section is something like what you can see on the left. Of course, it doesn't have to be quite so round, and it also completely depends on the maker and what their aim is aesthetically when they're producing their work. But when I'm pulling my handles, I'm aiming for the two examples on the left. What you don't want is a cross-section that's practically totally round, as when gripped the handle will pivot from side to side, making it quite unwieldy to use. The next step with the blank is to flare out one end of it, so I'm going to place it gently into my hand in such a way that the end pokes out by about 1/2 centimetre or so, extending past the edge of my hand. I'll then very lightly grip the handle blank, squeezing it, but not enough to distort the length in any way. The last thing you want to do is riddle the piece of clay with lots of indentations, so it's gripped firm enough just to keep it in place. I then tap the end that's extending outward to flare out the material here, first on one side, like so, and then I flip it around and do the other. My aim isn't to create a surface that's concave, in fact it should remain mostly flat. The problem being if you create too much of a divot, when this is pressed onto the cup you could potentially trap some air beneath it, and by flaring out the end of a blank I've essentially moved material into a place where it can easily be blended into the cup without having to take material from the length itself to create a strong, secure join. If I didn't make this flare, when I push the blank against the cup, I'd have to gouge away some material from the length itself, thus creating a thin spot close to the top of the handle, which later increases the chance that you'll simply tear the handle off. Now, I haven't forgot about scoring and slipping, I'll get onto that, but there's a reason I'm showing it later. First, I want to talk about attaching the blank to the cup. To do this, I apply equal pressure from the inside, bracing the interior wall with my fingertips. This way, the pressure of pushing the handle against the cup doesn't distort the thin wall. If instead I try to just push it on like this, not only would the round opening be distorted, but there's also a chance that you could indent the wall, creating a bulge on the inside. The area itself I'm going to be attaching the handle onto is scored using the serrated kidney and then covered in slip. The extra grooves mean the wet clay can penetrate the walls, creating a damp patch that the wetter handle should adhere nicely onto. You don't want to scrape away too much clay, and you don't want to use too much slip, and you don't want to do this too prematurely, as from the moment the wall is dampened, it'll begin to degrade and get soft, thus increasing the chance that attaching the handle will distort it, especially creating that bulge I mentioned previously on the inside. So as soon as it's been scored and slipped, I immediately flare out one end of the handle, attach it and pull it. There's no waiting. After scoring a pot, you may also notice lots of burrs of clay covering the tabletop, which I always sweep to one side, as otherwise they can embed themselves into the base of the cup when they're placed down to have their handles attached. So with the scored area slipped, you can think of it as glue, almost. I place my left hand inside the vessel to brace the wall. I make sure the rounded portion of the handle is facing downward, and then it's pushed really quite firmly against the cup. If your join isn't secure enough, that's another factor that can lead to cracks developing later on. And just like when I was flaring out the end of this, I'm trying to push it against the cup without overly distorting it, so I tend to hold it from the back and really push it forward, sometimes even wiggling and shaking it slightly to make sure the clays really mesh. If I feel like too much clay has bulged up towards the join, I squeeze the length of clay evenly backwards, shifting the thicker bulge of clay close to the join back into the length, and evenly is the key word here. Again, we want to keep the length itself as smooth and even as it can be, and you can see how that flared clay has bunched up around the join, and it's this material which I'll blend into the cup. You should also be able to shake it without it falling off, and if it does fall off, well then you haven't attached it securely enough. Here's what can happen if you push without those supportive fingers on the inside. Or if you've let that wet slip sit on the surface for too long. It creates a bump like this, which, whilst the pot is still totally functional, visually it's not really ideal, and it can cause issues to arise later, such as hairline cracks appearing in the rim. From this point, I'll begin blending in that flare of clay all the way around the join, using the side of my finger to smooth in more of the material at once. Then, around the edges of the handle, I tend to use my fingertip, and I really am pressing in the clay rather firmly, spreading it in a nice curve onto the body. I then wipe my finger sideways over the join to give it a more flush finish. Now, how much you choose to finish the join around the handle is up to you, but it also greatly depends on the glaze that's eventually going to coat this piece. For instance, the glazes I use tend to go on rather thickly. This means I can, in fact, leave the joins rather rough, and a few light smears and fingerprints won't matter, as the glaze will simply hide them. But there's nothing to stop you from using a sponge to make the join even more perfect. And with that, the handle is now ready to pull into its final shape. This process is more or less identical to how I was pulling the clay earlier from the block, although in this case it's important to pull as close to the top of the join as you can, as I want to make the entire length nice and even from top to bottom, and what I'm showing you now is just a slow motion demonstration of what I will be doing in a moment, with a wet hand of course. I pull with the handle in one orientation and then I flip it back to do the other, and I make sure to press that rounded portion of skin into the side of the handle so that it too is contained and kept nice and smooth. The one thing I have to avoid at all costs is creating a thin point at the top. If I press and pinch too firmly at the start, especially around the top of the join, there's a good chance I'll probably tear the handle off, and that's what I'll show you now. In this case, my pulling isn't consistent. I'm pinching firmly at the top and then I'm letting go too early, and gradually you'll be able to see a thin spot develop close to the top of the join. It looks a little something like this, and with successive pulls, what happens is that thin spot stretches thinner and thinner and then eventually comes off. Now, If this does happen to you, what I suggest is cutting this piece off so the surface is flush again. Let it dry, and then you can attach and pull another handle in its place. Now, the same thing can happen if you let too much clay build up on the end. As you're pinching more close towards the top, that thicker portion of clay will eventually catch on the bottom of your hand and you'll tear the lower section off, like so. In this instance, sometimes you might have enough material left to actually finish the handle, but if there isn't, simply slice the excess off, let the area dry, and then you can try again. And the good thing about learning this process is I can use the same cup over and over again until it literally falls apart. You can even practice pulling handles on things like old cans or glasses, but it is of course best to always do it on pots made from the same material, as managing how the two components dry properly together and how you blend them both at this stage are large parts of the process itself. And finally, I'll show you a successfully pulled handle. Normally I do all my scoring and slipping over the basin. This way the burrs of clay fall directly into the water. The join is then blended over and smoothed, and I keep that cloth close to me at all times, as when pulling the final shape, there are moments I need to dry my hands before touching the length of clay again. An apron does a good job for this too. You can, if you like, dip the handle itself in water. I soak my right hand too, and now I can begin pulling properly. My first couple of pulls are to gain length, so I'm mainly pinching between thumb and finger, starting right at the top and dragging the excess down. Watch how my right hand extends past the length of clay itself. This way pressure is maintained throughout the entire pull, which helps to keep the length nice and even. I work on one side and then the other, switching every couple of pulls, whilst also throwing in a few pulls where I press the skin between finger and thumb into the edges to round them. Now, there is one last thing I do during the pulling process I haven't spoken about yet, and that's gently pinching towards the top with the tip of my thumb and then dragging my fixed hand down the length of the handle. This removes just a bit of the thickness from the top, making the top join seem less bulky. I pull one groove in the very centre of the back of the handle and one on either side of it, but more on this later. The next thing I do with two mostly dry fingers is very gently run them over the sides of the handle. This ensures the handle is straight in relation to the cup, whilst also removing excess slip which can cause the handle to not hold its shape quite so well. I then very gently hold it from the bottom and then lower the angle of the cup whilst bringing the bottom of the handle to join it. And for the time being I just gently tack the bottom of the handle in place, with the excess poking out the end. And throughout this entire process, I've been really looking at the handle to make sure it's straight and that the top and bottom joins are lined up properly. Now, before I show you how I join the handle at the bottom, I first want to explain to you one thing, as it should help you understand why it's easier to join the handle towards the base. You'll notice when I pinch the form close to the top, as there's no floor of clay supporting the walls, they easily bow inward. This is why I have to be so careful when I attach the handle close to the rim, as the form will distort easily, whereas at the bottom I can press with the same amount of pressure and the walls barely move, as there's the expanse of the base that's bracing the two and holding the shape together. This means that when I attach the handle towards the bottom of the cup, I can use a lot more pressure and really smear the clay in around the join in a way that I wouldn't be able to do closer to the top. So the handle is carefully arched down, tacked on gently, just so it holds its shape, and so that I can check it quickly from all sides. Once I'm happy with its form, I'll quickly make any subtle adjustments with a wetted finger pressed very gently in the direction I want the arch to be most prominent. I never touch the edges, as it's easier to make more adjustments later once the handle is firmed up somewhat. I spend a moment just pressing the handle in close to the bottom just to secure it a bit better, and then I snip off the tail end. The excess clay around the base is then smeared in firmly on either side. Now, it's due to my aesthetic choice that I've joined the handle so close to the base of the pot, and in fact, if you join it a bit higher, you'll have much more room to work with, and you'll have an easier time blending the clay in nicely. Once it's looking mostly flush, I take a wet finger and just smooth over this slight mark towards the base, on the very bottom of the handle. And in the case with my mugs, as I attach them so close to the base itself, there is some smeared material on the very bottom, but I'll deal with that in a day or two, after these handles have dried out a bit. The finished cup is placed onto the plastic lime board I prepared earlier, and then I can move on to the next. Making handles like this is a repetitive process, but just like learning to throw, or learning an instrument or a language, it's repetition in practice that makes the biggest impact. The first 10 handles I pulled were dreadful, the 100th and 200th were okay, and the 1000th was great. You've also got to ruin a lot of handles to learn the extremities the material can take, so try using more force than you expect. See how that stretches the clay, and eventually you can temper that to find the right sort of pressure needed for the clay type you're working with. I'm just including this little sped up montage, as every time I move the mug, that's myself changing which side of the handle I'm working on. Once I feel like the length is getting long enough, I use the tip of my right thumb and I just rub it back and forth in place in the very middle, right towards the top, to create a small indentation. I then keep my thumb in that pinched position and drag it down the entire length of the handle, with at least one finger held directly behind where I'm pinching to counteract the pressure, otherwise the handle just tends to scoot forwards out of my reach. I then do the exact same thing on the sides of the handle, pinching in and quickly pulling down to create these 3 distinct grooves in the back, removing a bit of excess weight from that top join and just thinning out the overall length of the handle to make it finer. You absolutely don't have to do this, but it is something worth trying once you're a bit more comfortable with this technique. I then dry my right hand and run my fingers down the sides, making sure the handle is straight by looking at it from both the front and the side. I then grip the bottom of the handle and loop it towards the base, tacking it on and joining it, like previously shown. There is one thing I've been doing as I pull the final shape, but I haven't really mentioned it yet, as it is another rather advanced technique. But essentially, as I pull the handle into its final shape, I try and use less and less water, leaving the handle in a relatively dry state before it's looped down and attached towards the bottom. This way, the drier length of clay holds its shape better. It also helps if you pull a handle quickly. Of course, that's not possible at the start, but you should aim to get faster, as the longer you spend pulling a length of clay, the weaker and more saturated with water it gets, meaning that once the clay has been looped down and attached, it won't hold its shape nearly so well. The same thing can be said if it's covered in slip and is really wet, which I'll demonstrate with this handle here, which I'm over pulling and saturating with water on purpose. It's already beginning to sag down and isn't holding its shape nearly so well, and you can see when I try and make some minor adjustments to it, it just flops back down into a not very good shape. It of course isn't a skill you have to be really fast at, but the quicker they're pulled and with less water, the stronger they'll be, and you'll find they keep their shape much better. This is the kind of shape I'm aiming for. Once pulled, I do just quickly check the rim to make sure it's nice and round, and I can make any small adjustments if need be. Now, as I've joined soft clay to leather hard clay, how these mugs are dried out hereafter is of vital importance. They cannot just be left out, as the thinner, smaller handles will dry out more quickly, especially as air can get all the way around them, meaning that cracks will most likely develop around the top and bottom joints. So once I have a board's worth, I line them up in such a way that none of the handles are touching. I even place kiln props next to some of them, so the plastic sheeting won't stick to them. I then spray them rather liberally with water, and then I wrap them up tightly. The idea with this is that the two components of differing textures over the next couple of days will gradually acclimatise to each other and become the same in the damp environment I've encased them in. It's only after they've been wrapped up and held in suspension like this that I'll unwrap them and dry them out properly, or let them simply dry out beneath plastic slowly. This way, as long as they've been joined onto the pot correctly, no cracks should develop. The only places where I sometimes get very tiny hairline cracks are on these bottom joints, but it's quite common to get them around the top too. You can try, if you want, to brush some wax over these joints. This way they'll dry out much more slowly, hopefully at the same rate of the handle and cup next to it. I don't think it's a method you should become reliant on, but if for some reason you are experiencing problems and cracks keep developing in the same places, this is a good method to tide you over until you figure out the root cause. Now, the next two handles I'll be showing you are ones that are incorrect, in my opinion, due to their size. The first is a handle that's far too big. It overpowers the mug, and when holding it, it feels like the mug is on the end of a long pole, making it feel awkward and clumsy to use. As it overhangs so much, you'll also have a very difficult time getting these handles to keep their shape without sagging down so much. The next handle is one that's far too small, although perhaps deceptively, as it works proportionally, but by the time this is dried, been glazed, and fired, the negative space inside the handle would be too small for it to be used functionally, as your fingers that hold the cup would be far too close to the wall of the pot, which holds scalding hot liquid, and if the walls of the cup are thin, like they are here, your fingers could become uncomfortable if they come into prolonged contact with the wall of the mug, so I think it helps to pull the handle just a fraction larger than you think. For this next segment, I'll show you the pulling of a handle in real time, focusing on what my thoughts are at each particular step, beginning with the handle being scored and slipped on and the flare of clay blended in. I begin by dipping the handle in water and soaking my hand, and for my first couple of pulls on either side, I'm focusing on getting mass out close to the top and really stretching the piece of clay. I don't mind if it's a bit messy at this stage, my aim is just to make it long enough. Now I'm looking at it from the front to make sure it's straight in relation to the cup. For these next couple of pulls, I'm really focusing on smoothing the sides by pressing in the skin in between finger and thumb. And with it feeling even all the way around, I begin to pull the grooves in the back of the handle. And with each pull, I strip away a bit of the slip that covers the surface, creating a handle that's much drier than it was initially when I first started pulling. I then dry my hand so I don't add any more moisture to the handle and do a few final pulls to really define the grooves in the back. It's best to work at eye level so you can really see what you're doing, as to get it shaped right I'm constantly looking at the handle from many different sides. I use my finger and thumb just to do a few adjustments close to the top, where it was looking a bit scruffy, mainly to make sure the curve on the back of the handle flows into the cup nicely. And with that, I change the position of my left hand, gripping the vessel from the side so that I can more easily angle it downward with the handle like so. I tack it on and check it from front and side, and it was leaning just a bit one way, which is why I fling it to one side like this, straightening it. I then press in some of the excess clay across the entire base so it's held on more tightly, which means when I snip off the excess, the whole thing doesn't come loose. I use a slightly wet thumb so it doesn't stick, just to give the handle a bit more lift, and then at the bottom join I begin to really smear the clay in on either side, intentionally pressing it in firmly. As I found in the past, I was being a bit gentle, and it's that was leading to some hairline cracks forming. I remove any small lumps or bumps so the handle looks like it flows back into the base really naturally, and all the tiny bits of clay I'm removing with my fingers I'm placing into the basin underneath me. Not every handle needs this much assessment, but as you're pulling you'll find that sometimes the shapes do vary slightly, but once joined at the bottom they can all be fixed and made right. Lastly, I use a dab of water just to smooth over the smudges on the very bottom, compressing the clay and really working on its curve. There was a tiny smidge of clay that was just out of line at the top, so that's flattened, which again I'm doing with a wetted finger. This way it doesn't stick to the length of clay, as if you are using a dry fingertip, for instance. Not only does it stick to the length, but when you try and remove it, it can draw the entire handle out of shape too. And that's the handle finished. A bit slower than usual due to the additional cleanup at the end, but sometimes that's something you've just got to do. So, there you have it. That's how I pull one of my handles. I know this video made it into quite a long process, but in reality, once practiced, it's remarkable just how quick and efficient this can be, and it creates handles that are so personal to their maker. There are often still fingerprints and grooves left by the person who pulled it, and it's also, surprisingly, really rather a lot of fun. And it always gets a good laugh too, if you're showing it to somebody who's never seen it before. The last thing I want to go over is how I clean up the base post-handling. There's always a bit of material that gets smeared onto the bottom, so I place the cup onto the same chuck I used previously, center it, which can be really tricky with a handle protruding like this. The cup is then lightly pushed down so it's held in place, and then I turn away that smeared portion of clay. I then use the flat, very smooth side of a plastic kidney to burnish this outer edge, and it's also at this stage where I'll check the bottom for any burrs of clay that might have become lodged into the base, or check for any scratches or scuffs, which there could be from when I initially attached the handle to the cup. Then, as sometimes the handling process can make the opening just a touch oval, to revert it back to its perfectly round shape, I lightly press it down onto the chuck as it's spinning. Don't push down too hard though, as it might cause the rim to flare out slightly or crack. And at long last, that's the handle properly attached, the base finished, and the rim rounded. All of these handle vessels will then go back onto a plastic lined sheet, which, if it's particularly warm or the kilns have been on, are wrapped tightly. Otherwise, they can be covered loosely and allowed to dry out more quickly. And eventually, I hope you'll end up with some mugs that you really love. Going through the stage of ruining good pots with bad handles happens to everyone, but I promise with enough practice you will push beyond that and make handles that are not only professional but unique to you. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch, especially if you made it all the way to the end. I so hope this video has proved useful, and if it helps one person make handles they're more happy with, then, well, that's my job done. Thanks for spending the last half hour with me, and I'll see you next time.